Okay, sometimes Harav Lichtenstein would be mechadesh something to us, and when he would say it, it was like a wow, and a crazy, amazing chiddush. And then afterwards, it'll be like, wow, it's so obvious, it's so pashut. How is it anyone didn't always see this before? And what Lichtenstein says about Shemita and Yovel is an amazing example of this. The classic view of Shemita and Yovel is you have Shemita every 7 years, and then after 7 cycles of 7, you add another year, an extra Shemita year. And there's no real fundamental difference between Shemita and Yovel. You even have phrases, the Rambam says that there's almost no difference between the halachas of Shemita and Yovel, ein bein zeh lezeh, chutz mi 1 or 2 tiny things. But Harav Lichtenstein dedicates the whole article here about Shemita and Yovel to show that actually there's a fundamental difference between the nature of Shemita and the nature of Yovel. And he says you see this from the very beginning when just looking at the Pesukim. The Pesukim which describe Shemita constantly describe Shemita as Shabbat Lashem. It's a Shabbat which is dedicated to Hashem. That phrase never appears in the context of Yovel. It's only there to describe the Shemitah. And Rishon said it really expresses the fundamental difference which he goes on to delve into, that on Shemitah year, the Pesukim emphasize over and over again that the main mitzvah of Shemitah is the Shvita, the total cessation of work in the agricultural plane. And Rishon said the fact that the Torah calls it Shabbat Lashem and emphasizes the mitzvah of Shvita, of not working, is because that's the essence of the year. That's the whole goal of the year. The cessation of working in the Shemitah year is the goal in and of itself, that the land should rest. In Yovel, there's also a prohibition to work the land. But the Torah doesn't describe Shvita and doesn't call it Shabbat Lashem. It does mention there's a prohibition to work the land, but it seems clear from the way the Pesukim are structured that the prohibition to work the land is not the goal, it's just a means to a bigger goal. The Pesukim which describe Yovel begin not with the prohibition of working the land, but with the main mitzvot of the year. The fact that the shofar is blown in the beginning of the year, the mitzvah to return all the ancestral fields to their original ancestral families, and the mitzvah to free slaves every Yovel year. They're the main mitzvot of the Yovel. That's the goal of the year, whereas the prohibition of working on the land is merely a means to the ends. Lichtenstein compares this to an idea which he develops at length in the beginning of the book, the difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Lichtenstein explains that Shabbat, the Kedushat of Shabbat, the main goal of Shabbat, the actual Shvita from Melacha on Shabbat, is the goal in and of itself. There's a value in and of itself in the essence of Shabbos to rest. Whereas when it comes to Yom Tov, the goal isn't to be a day of rest. The prohibition of working on Yom Tov is merely a means to an end. And therefore, the prohibition isn't absolute. Ochel nefesh is mutter, and other things which are necessary for the sake of the day are mutter. But the real idea of the Issa Melacha on Yom Tov is to create a space in time, where Am Yisrael can dedicate themselves the true goals of each Yom Tov. And every single Yom Tov has its own goals and its own agenda. And the Issa Melacha is just there as a means to allow that space to exist. Says Harav Lichtenstein, it's exactly the same, the difference between Shemitah and Yovel. Shemitah is a Shabbat Lashem. It's just like Shabbat. The prohibition of doing work is a means in and of itself, as a goal to itself. Whereas by Yovel, it's like Yom Tov, that the prohibition of doing Melacha is just a means in order to allow us to create a year dedicated to the goals of the year. Lichtenstein takes this one stage further. The formulation of the actual Isurim on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and on Shemitah and Yovel are also different. By Shemitah, again, the Torah uses the term Shvita, lishbot from Melacha. Whereas on Yovel, the Torah relates to each and every one of the prohibitions individually, but doesn't use the term Shvita. It says don't plow and don't reap and don't sow. Why? Because in the Yovel, there's not an overarching idea of ceasing from doing Melacha, but rather it's necessary to forbid various different actions in order to allow the broader goals of the year to be achieved. Whereas by Shemitah, where the idea is the cessation of work itself is the goal, so the idea is an overarching idea, and therefore the more broad term, lishbot, is used over and over again. Lichtenstein says this is expressed even further in a number of chumrot that we find by the Shemitah year beyond the Yovel year. The Marshal suggests that unlike on Shabbat, where to ask a non-Jew to do melacha for you is an issa d'Rabbanan, he derives from various pesukim that on Shemitah year there is a Torah prohibition of Amir Lagoy, to ask a goy to do work in the field. The Ibn Ezra expands this more. He says, not only there's also a prohibition of asking a ger toshav to do work in Eretz Yisrael. The Minchat Chinuch says, anytime somebody asks somebody else to do work in the field, it is included in the Torah prohibition. Why? Why do these chumras exist? Because the Torah demands that the land should rest. So what difference does it make whether I do the work myself, I ask a non-Jew to do it, there's a ger toshav doing it, another friend is doing it for me? At the end of the day, it's my responsibility to ensure the land should actually rest. Lichtenstein points out that all the sources used by the various different poskim to describe and form a source for these prohibitions are all talking about the Shemitah. And they're all based on psukim which only exist by the Shemitah. The Minchat Chinuch suggests, based on this, he says, maybe it's possible that these chumrot exist only by the Shemitah and not by the Yovel. So Lichtenstein turns and says, it's not possible. The Minchat Chinuch says, maybe. Lichtenstein says, it's not maybe, it's clear, it's obvious. Not only are the sources only said by the Shemitah year, but the fundamental difference between Shemitah and Yovel demands that distinction exists. So, for example, the Lichtenstein adds, the Rambam has not only a prohibition of doing work on the Shemitah year, but he also has a mitzvah tasei. There's an active, positive value in resting. That mitzvah tasei doesn't apply to the Yovel. Why? Because the fundamental difference between the two periods of time. You could take this one stage further, this comparison between Shemitah and Shabbat, and Yovel and Yom Tov one stage further. We know that one of the major distinctions between Shabbat and Yom Tov is that the Kedusha of Shabbat is inherent. It's Kaviyah v'Kaima. It's always there. Kodesh Baruch Hu is Mekadesh Shabbat, and we don't need to do anything in order for the day of Shabbat to be holy. Whereas by Yom Tov, the Kedusha of Yom Tov is created by Am Yisrael. When Am Yisrael see the new moon and they Mekadesh the Chodesh, they Mekadesh the calendar, that creates the Kedusha of Yom Tov. That's the explanation of the bracha we say on when it's both Shabbat and Yom Tov. We say Mekadesh HaShabbat Yisrael v'Azmanim. Kodesh Baruch Hu is Mekadesh Shabbat. Doesn't need Am Yisrael's involvement. But then Hashem is Mekadesh Am Yisrael, and Am Yisrael are Mekadesh the Chagim. Were Am Yisrael not to be Mekadesh the Chagim, then they simply wouldn't exist. Lichtenstein says the same thing is true by Shemitah and Yovel. In the Torah we find that by the Yovel it says, Ukadashtem et Yovel. You have to be sanctified the Yovel. You have to make it the day Kadosh. Such a phrase never appears in the context of Shemitah. And the Rambam, when he brings down the mitzvah d'oraita to be Mekadesh the Yovel, says there's a mitzvah to say for the Yovel, but there's no such mitzvah for the Shemitah year. Why? So according to Rav Lichtenstein's Mahalach, it's obvious. Because Shemitah is a Shabbat Lashem, and therefore the Kedusha is inherent in the land, and every 7 years it will automatically be Kadosh. Whereas when it comes to the Yovel year, it requires Am Yisrael to actively be Mekadesh the year in order for it to gain Kedusha. Lichtenstein points out, if you turn to the beginning of Masechet Moed Katan, there seems to be a Gemara there that flies in the face of everything he says. The Gemara there says that there's a hekesh, some sort of a connection built in the Pesukim between Shemitah and Yovel. And through that hekesh, all the dinner that apply to Shemitah are transferred over to the Yovel. So for example, the Gemara there uses it to say that just as there's a prohibition of Shmitat Kasafim, or the din of Shmitat Kasafim, the person has to renege on all loans when it comes to the Shemitah year, that also applies to the Yovel year as well. According to Rav Lichtenstein's Mahalach, none of this should be true. Shemitah and Yovel are fundamentally different worlds. You can't compare one to the other. By Shemitah, the goal is ceasing, resting. That's a goal in of itself. By Yovel, the real goals of the year are freeing slaves and returning the fields. Why is there any place for a hekesh between Shemitah and Yovel? So Lichtenstein says if there is a hekesh, it must be that there's a common denominator between Shmita and Yovel. And here Lichtenstein suggests that actually Shmita itself contains within it two different aspects. On the one hand, there's the aspect we've mentioned, that the land has to rest fallow for a whole year. It's a Shabbat Lashem. But there's another aspect of the Shmita year. And that's not the agricultural, the land itself resting. It's the socio-economic facet of the Shmita year. The idea that there's a resettling of the economics within society, and people have to be able to rest and dedicate themselves to the social causes. That is expressed most profoundly by the Shmita year in the din of Shmitat Kasafim, of reneging on loans. It's not just a question of another aspect of ceasing to do something. It's the social aspect of the Shmita year. So Rav Lichtenstein points out that if there's a connection between Shmita and Yovel, it's specifically in the second aspect. The idea that there's also a socio-economic aspect of the Shmita year, and in that aspect, there's a comparison between Shmita and Yovel, because also in Yovel, the idea of the slaves going free, of the ancestral land returning to its original families, that's all part of that broader idea. But Lichtenstein goes further and goes back to the Pesukim. The Shmita appears twice in the Torah. Once in Parashat Mishpatim, and the other in Parashat Bahar. In Parashat Bahar, the emphasis over and over again is on, it's a Shabbat Lashem, and the land belongs to Hashem and therefore has to rest every 7 years. But in Parashat Mishpatim, the discussions there emphasize the socio-economic aspect of Shmita. And if there's a Hekesh, it's specifically from that Parashat in Mishpatim to the Yovel. Lichtenstein takes this then even one stage further. He says, if you look in Shmita, we'll actually notice there's a distinction between the different prohibitions that exist. As well as the Torah mentioning, as we mentioned before, the broader idea of Shvita as an overarching idea, the Torah does mention the different prohibitions that exist. There is the prohibition of being choresh, of plowing, of ketzira, of reaping, of bitsira, of picking the fruit, zriya, sowing in the ground, zmira, pruning. All these things the Torah mentions as they're being asa on the Shmita year. But when you look in halacha, we actually find there's a sharp distinction between two lists. When it comes to zriya, charisha, zmira, planting in the ground, plowing the ground, pruning in order to encourage growth, those things, we never find any sort of heter in the Shmita year. They are prohibited under all circumstances. But there's another list, ketzira and bitsira, picking the fruit or reaping the fruit from the ground, the produce from the ground. There, it's clear from the Mishnah, and it's developed much more in the Yerushalmi, there are various different heterim. There are different factors. If the field is a hefka field, or if the malacha is done in an unusual way, so there are various different opinions about how these two factors combine. But the common denominator to all the different opinions is these factors are relevant in order that sometimes reaping from the field or picking the fruit are actually permitted. Lichtenstein asks, why should that be? Why should some things be prohibited under all circumstances, and some things, sometimes you find a heter? When's the heter? When you don't own the field or you do it in an unusual way. Why should that be? Says Rav Lichtenstein, it would appear that the aspect of Shmita, which is a Shabbat Lashem, where the goal in and of itself is the resting of the land, that demands a prohibition under all circumstances. And indeed, in Parashat Bahar, which focuses on that aspect of the Shmita, it only mentions Zriya and Charisha, as learned out from the Pesukim, and Zmira. But the Ketzira and Bitsira aren't mentioned. What's Ketzira and Bitsira? You're not actually working in the land itself, but rather you're picking the fruit. So on the one hand, it's an agricultural activity, but you're not actually working the land. So the kiyum of not working the land is expressed in the prohibition of planting and plowing and pruning, and therefore those prohibitions are absolute and they appear in Parashat Bahar. Whereas in Parashat Mishpatim, which aspects focuses more on the socio-economic aspects of the Shemitah, so there the prohibition is more like the Yovel. And therefore our goal is to create a space. We have to prohibit being involved in agricultural activity in order that person will be able to realize that he doesn't really own everything and he has to get involved in other more social economic values. And therefore, Parashat Mishpatim, we mentioned the prohibition of Ketzira and Bitsira. And let's say in a case where the field is ownerless, or it was done in unusual ways, so there are heterim, and it makes sense. If you don't own the field, so you're not expressing ownership and mastery over the field, and therefore it doesn't come under and not included in the prohibition. One of the big questions that comes out of Rav Lichtenstein's comparison between the Yovel and Yom Tov is the fact that we have to be Mekadesh the year in order to be Kadosh. So Lichtenstein asks, how is the year sanctified? What do we need to do? So the Gemara says that the 3 mitzvot that apply to the Yovel, freeing the slaves, returning their ancestral fields, and blowing the shofar, the Gemara says those things are ma'akev. They hold back the Kedushat. If you don't do them, then the year isn't Kadosh. So he says maybe those are the things that actually generate the Kedusha, and that's what it sounds like by in the Ibn Ezra on the Torah. However, it's not necessarily true. It could be that if you don't do those things, then they'll prevent the Kedusha expressing itself. But that's not what actually creates the Kedusha. And in the Rambam, it's clear that's true. The Rambam writes that in order for the Yovel year to become Kadosh, Am Yisrael have to directly sanctify the year and declare it as Kadosh. How do they do that? They count. Just like we have Sfirat HaOmer and you count 49 days to Shavuos. So when it comes to the Yovel, you have to count every single year. The Beit Din, the Sanhedrin, representing Am Yisrael, count every single year. When they get to the 50th year, they're Makadesh it. Just like on Rosh Chodesh, the Beit Din declare the new month to be Kadosh, Mukudash, Mukudash, Mukudash. So to the Yovel year requires the same thing. And Reb Chaim develops this within the Rambam, and also the Ramban al Torah describes this at length, that we actually have to sanctify and declare the year to be Kadosh. And that's what creates the Kedusha. So we have 2 ideas here. One is declaring the year to be Kadosh, and the other is the existence of the mitzvot during the year, so they're necessary in order for the year to be Kadosh, but they don't create the Kedusha. Now, Rav Lichtenstein asked the following question. When we Mekadesh the year, how exactly do we do that? And there's 2 ways he suggests that this could be understood. One way is to say, all that we need to do is to declare, this is the Yovel year. Give it its identity. We have declared that this is the Yovel year, and now it's identified, it has that shame in the year of being the Yovel year. All the dinim of the Yovel year then follow automatically, since it's the Yovel year. So it's Asa b'malacha, and the slaves will go free, and everything else will happen. But the essential act of Kiddush is simply to give an identification to the year, declare it to be the Yovel year. The second option is, no, since there are various different mitzvot in the Yovel year, we have to designate the year for the purpose of each of those mitzvot. We have to declare that, designate the year, this is the year in which we're going to free the slaves. This is the year in which we're going to give back the ancestral land. And each aspect requires its own unique kedusha, its yi'ud, its designation. What would be the distinction? So Rav Lichtenstein says this can explain a very difficult piece of Gemara. The Gemara says, on the one hand, as we mentioned, that the 3 mitzvot that apply to the Yovel year, freeing the slaves, the land, and the blowing the shofar, we only do those from Yom Kippur. But the prohibition of doing melacha in the field, that begins on Rosh Hashanah. So for 10 days, it would seem that the whole status of Yovel is in limbo. Because if we get to Yom Kippur and we don't free the slaves, or we don't return the ancestral land, then it turns out, that we said the Merakev Kedusha, it turns out the land wasn't Kadosh. But how does that work? So Lichtenstein says, apparently, the Kedusha of the Yovel is only fixed retrospectively once after Yom Kippur we begin to keep the mitzvot. But how can we do that? How can we mekadesh something retrospectively? Says Rav Lichtenstein, it depends on the 2 ways that we understand the Kiddush. If being mekadesh the year means giving it an identity, this is the Yovel year, so you can do that even in the middle of the year. Just like on Rosh Chodesh, if the Eidim who saw the new moon would turn up in the middle of the day, and they say, today is the first day of the month. So from when did it become the first day of the month? Clearly, retrospectively, from the beginning of that day. They might have only turned up in the Beit Din and declared it to be the first of the month in the middle of the day, but by doing so, they've turned the entire 24 period from the beginning of the day into Rosh Chodesh. The same thing is true by Yovel. Once we start keeping the mitzvot of the Yovel, it actually turns out that retrospectively that it's been the Yovel from the beginning of the year, from Rosh Chodesh, from Rosh Chodesh Elul, from Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. And then That's from that moment in time begins the Issa Melacha. The Issa Melacha is simply a function of the fact that the year was declared to be the Yovel year. But the mitzvot, the unique special mitzvot, which are the goals of the year, for that we actually have to do them in order to inject the unique Kedusha into the year that allows those things to occur.